All right, this is a parable from the Gospel of Luke. This parable is very strange, and that's why I chose it, because it's a strange parable. All right. Then Jesus said to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, "What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer." Then the manager said to himself, "What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes." So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. And he said to him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, "How much do you owe?" And he replied, 100 containers of wheat. And he said to him, "Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." This is the word of the Lord. All right. So, we are leaving behind our God and Art sermon series. And I thought that was a good ride. Didn't you all? Did you enjoy that? And I hope that you had the opportunity to, thank you. I hope you had the opportunity to see the film that Adam and I worked so hard on to put together. It was a real testament, I think, to our community, to the families in our community, and also to what it means to be a family here at our church. So if you haven't had a chance, I hope that you will see it. There's DVDs out there at the Welcome Center. Take one, or you can watch it on the website. But we are moving on to a new series. It's called Modern Parables. Now, as Katie was talking about, Jesus, he was famous for telling parables, and he told parables as a way to draw people in so that people would listen to his message. Now, what is a parable? Well, a parable is a simple story that is told with the explicit purpose of illustrating a moral or spiritual point. Almost all the stories that Jesus told in parable form, they were almost all fiction, and when he told them, he usually gave no further explanation beyond the parable itself to the hearers. And this is because when a parable is told well, all you need to do is listen to the story in order to take away the meaning. Now, that might not be the best example with what we just read, but the fact is, that's how it usually works. And so what I'm going to do is, we're going to be basically taking a parable, we're going to read it, and then I'm going to transpose that parable into a modern setting. So from now all the way through Easter, what's going to happen is we're going to read a parable or a narrative from Jesus' life, and then I'm going to tell you a story. These stories are going to be fictional, although I will be drawing on real people and real events in order to create the story. So it's kind of like historical fiction. But you can't go back and research these stories fact for fact, like my other sermons. Now, furthermore, I'm not going to give you any explanation as to what I want you to take away from the story, okay? So at the end, just like Jesus, right? He told the story and he moved on and went on to something else. And that's essentially what's going to happen. I'm going to tell you the story, and that's it. You guys have to kind of discern the meaning for yourselves. Some of you will really not like this very much. I have a feeling. Because you like the fact that I tell you this is what I want you to take away from it, right? But my hope is that you all will get together with your friends, your family, and you'll have a discussion about what exactly was this story about, and more importantly, what is it that Jesus was trying to get at through his parable. And I think that through this, you all will find that you are just as bright and intelligent as the pastors who have studied this our whole lives, because you all have a lot to bring to this. You all can have a lot of discernment when it comes to these types of parables. So, are we ready to get going? All right. So, our story today, it begins in mid-2005, and it revolves around this abandoned warehouse that was located right off of the Hudson Bay in New York City. Now, this warehouse, it was originally used for a long time to store toxic chemicals. And it stopped storing toxic chemicals a number of years prior, but the owner of the property could not get this off of his books because he obviously had a property that nobody really wanted because it had toxic chemicals in it. So he eventually decided, you know what, I'm going to take this thing to auction. And when it goes to auction, the opening bid is $1. And that's exactly what it sells for at auction, is $1. Now, the new owner of this particular warehouse, he liked this warehouse because it had two levels. The first level had all of the toxic chemicals in it. Nobody was going to be working down there. But it's the next level that he liked even more because it was this big, wide, open space. It was about the size of a football field. And he had very specific plans for what he wanted to do with this. So from the middle of 2005 all the way to January of 2006, he spends about $5 million rehabbing that second floor. He puts in air and ventilation, electricity, and he puts cubicles in there that go up and down in these long rows, and in each cubicle, he has a computer and a telephone. And 2 weeks after this entire thing was complete, every single one of those cubicles was going to be filled with people. And the job of those people in those cubicles was to call people up on the phone and to sell loans for houses. Now, what you have to understand about this is that at this time, around 2003, the government had loosened its restrictions on what was required for a person to obtain a housing loan. And by 2006, the restrictions were so lax that a person with no income and no assets could actually obtain a housing loan. I'd like you to listen to a story of one such person who got a loan. His name is Clarence Nathan. He's going to tell you about how he got this loan and what happened.
Clarence Nathan. He worked 3 part-time, not very steady jobs, and made a total of $45,000 a year, roughly. He got himself into trouble and needed money, so he took out a loan against his house, a big one.
Call it $540 for round figures.
You basically borrowed $540,000 from the bank, and they didn't check your income.
Right. It's a no-income verification loan. They don't call me up and say, how much money. They don't do that. I mean, it's almost like you pass a guy in the street and you say, you lend me $540,000? He said, well, what do you do? I got a job. Okay. I mean, it seems as if it's that casual, even though there are a lot of papers that get filled out and stuff flies all over with the faxes and the emails and all like that. Essentially, that's the process.
Would you have loaned you the money?
I wouldn't have loaned me the money, and nobody that I know would have loaned me the money. I mean, I know guys who are criminals that wouldn't lend me that money, and they break your kneecap. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know why the bank did it. I'm serious. I mean, $540,000, a person with bad credit.
As it turns out, Clarence's friends, acquaintances, and shadowy criminal contacts would have been right not to lend him the money. At the time I talked to him, Clarence hadn't made a payment in almost a year, and his house was in the process of foreclosure.
All right. So, this loan that he was given, it's called a NINA loan. It stands for No Income, No Asset Loan. And that word NINA, it was programmed into the screensavers of all of those computers in that warehouse. This particular company was going to specialize in selling these NINA loans. And so the managers, what they did was they put ads in the newspaper and they were looking for mortgage brokers. And one of those mortgage brokers was a man named Glenn Pissarro. He was a 22-year-old college graduate who had just obtained his mortgage license. So he goes to this warehouse for his first day of work. He gets inside the elevator, which has literally graffiti all over it. And he's going up and he hears this murmuring as he's going up in the elevator. And it's like the buzzing of bees, and he's not entirely sure what's wrong with the elevator. But then it opens up, and he sees this explosion of people. There are people just climbing over each other. They're in these cubicles. They're talking to each other. And it's just this loud sound that comes out at him. And he walks into the room, and he's looking for his supervisor, who he eventually finds. His supervisor takes him over to the cubicle, sits him down, and points to a binder that is on this desk. And this binder is 500 pages thick. And on each page, there is this really teeny, small print. And each line has a name and a phone number next to it. And he says to Glenn, start at the top and you work your way down. If you don't know what to say, there's a script on your desk. And your quota for the month is 20 loans for $5 million. You don't make that quota, we're going to give your cubicle to somebody else. And that was his introduction to his job. So he sits down and he does what his supervisor says. He starts dialing numbers. He's calling people up. And he realizes very quickly he's not very good at this just on his own, so he takes the script and he starts using the script. And this is what the script looked like. Mr. or Mrs., whoever you are, this is Glenn Passaro, and I have some amazing news that is going to change your life. It is now possible for those who were traditionally denied home ownership to become homeowners. For the same amount that you are right now paying in rent, you can own your own home. Would you like to become a homeowner? Yeah, of course you would, right? All right. Well, that's great. So let me fill you in on the details because this is going to be one of the most important calls of your life. Now, after making a few of these calls and selling a few of these loans, Glenn made a very quick realization. These people were poor. Most of these people could not afford to make a payment on a car, let alone a mortgage payment on a house. And so eventually, he gets up the courage to go to his supervisor, and he asks him what seems to be a fairly obvious question. He says, clearly these people don't have a lot of money. So aren't you worried that they're going to stop making payments and default on the loan? And his supervisor looks him straight in the eye and says, no, not at all. Because once they sign on the dotted line, that loan is no longer on our books. Every loan that you sell is in turn sold to a larger bank. So whether they make good on the loan or not our problem. Our job is to sell the loan, period. So if you don't like that, you can go find yourself another job. So Glenn, he goes back to his desk. This is his first job. He wants to make a good impression, right? And so what does he do? He just keeps calling. And of course, there's this voice in the back of his mind that's saying to him, well, maybe there's something not quite right about this, right? But then those voices were put to rest when he got his first paycheck, which was more than $15,000. He had never seen that much money in his entire life. And he figured at this rate, he could pay off all of his student loans in less than a year. After he cashed this check, he went out and got his fiancée. They went to the fanciest restaurant in Manhattan. They dropped $700 on a single meal just for the two of them. Very quickly, Glenn became addicted to the idea that the more loans he sold, the more money he had in his pocket. And he noticed something interesting about the other people who occupied the cubicles around him. Most of those people lasted 2 or 3 months max, and they were gone. They couldn't keep up with the pace. But Glenn, before he knew it, a year had gone by, and he was one of the top producers at this company. He was regularly bringing home anywhere between $75,000 and $100,000 a month. He was making more than $1 million a year. Now, let's listen to some of the ways that Glenn liked to spend this money.
We would roll up to Marquee at midnight with a line 500 people deep out front, walk right up to the door, give me my table. We're sitting next to Tara Reid and a couple of her friends. We're sitting, Christina Aguilera was doing whatever, I'm Christina Aguilera, I'm going to get up and sing. So Christina Aguilera and all her people are there. Who else was there? Cuba Gooding and that kid from Filthy Rich Cattle Drive. What was that kid's name? Fabian Barabi? I don't know. We order probably 3 or 4 bottles of Cristal. at $1,000 a bottle. They bring it out with, they're walking through the crowd. They hold the bottles over their head. There's firecrackers in them, the sparklers, the little cocktail waitresses. So you order 4 bottles of those. They're walking through the crowd, of people. Everybody's like, whoa, who's the cool guys? Well, we were the cool guys. You know what I mean? They gave me a black card, this little card with my name on it. There's probably like 10 of them in existence, and that meant that I just spent way too much money there.
Of course, the dream wouldn't last because by 2008, our entire economy had collapsed due to these types of loans. And Glenn, he found himself out of a job. And that company that he worked for, they had closed its doors. And Glenn found that it was actually kind of hard for him to find another job in the mortgage or banking industry because his company had a reputation for preying on the poor and nobody really wanted to hire him. In fact, his particular company was at the top of the government's list for prosecution. And in a letter that was sent to the government from the owner of this company in relation to the charges that they had acted according to fraudulent transactions, they had committed fraudulent transactions. He said that all of my companies, they operate according to the highest standards of ethical conduct, but unfortunately there were a few corrupt managers in this company that took advantage of the system and gamed it. Now, Glenn had been promoted to manager a year earlier, and he was one of the people who was named in this suit against the government. And so he was looking at 5 years in federal prison if he was convicted. Now, thankfully, Glenn had saved most of his money. And he was going to need every dollar of it because he had to pay these lawyers a lot of money. He estimated it was going to cost around $750,000 to successfully defend against these charges. He was placed under house arrest, and he was told, you have 6 months until the trial begins. Now, about 3 months before the trial was set to begin, he received a really interesting phone call that came really out of the blue. And it was one of these people to whom he had sold a mortgage, a home loan. And it was a person who he was surprised that they could get his phone number because it's not like they knew it. This woman had seriously done some digging on the internet. Her name was Sharon Johnson. She was the mother of 3 little boys. She was a single mom. And Glenn had sold her a loan for $200,000 for a house that she could not afford. And she didn't understand why the bank was about to foreclose and take away her home. Because Glenn had told her very specifically, you can afford this house for the same amount that you are paying in rent. And so Glenn, he had to explain to her, he's like, look, this loan that I sold you, this Nina loan, it fluctuates. The payments fluctuate based on the interest rates. When interest rates are low, your payments are low. When they go up, as they had done recently, well, your payments are going to go up significantly. In fact, her payments had doubled since Glenn had sold her the loan. And she was on the other end of the line. She's in tears and she's begging him, is there anything you can do? Because for the first time in her life, her family was stable. So she had a decent paying job. Her husband, who was physically abusive towards her and her boys, he was in prison for robbery. And she feared that if her home was foreclosed on, that she would have her credit wiped out. She couldn't even then get an apartment. And so she'd lose her job because she'd have to move back in with her parents, who are drunks, just like her ex-husband. And Glenn, as he's listening to this on the line, he's sitting there thinking to himself, this is not my problem. You should have read the fine print and understood what it was you were signing before you got this loan. But as he was thinking through it, he did realize that he had a little bit of a role to play in it, in the sense that he never told her to read the fine print, and he knew that if she did, she would have never signed the loan. And what's more, he told her everything that she wanted to hear, and he gave her assurances that he knew were false. And so at the end of the conversation, he says, look, here's what I want you to do. I want you to send me your banking statement, your mortgage statement. Mail it to me. So she mails it to him. He opens it up. He looks. She owes $185,000 on the principal of the loan. So he writes a check for $185,000. And he sends it to her with a little note on the inside that says, "May your house become a home for you and your boys." 3 months go by. Glenn is now at trial. On the prosecution side, they have 3 lawyers who are ready to take their case to the judge against Glenn. And then on the other side, you have Glenn, who's sitting there all by himself. And the judge, he starts talking to Glenn, and he says, "Son, the last time you were here at pretrial, you had a whole team of lawyers on your side. Where are they?" And he looks up and he says, "Your Honor, I had to dismiss them." And the judge is now quite concerned about this, and he says, "Well, why did you dismiss them?" He says, "Well, I can no longer afford to pay them, Your Honor." Now, at this point, the judge is very suspicious because he says, "I've seen your bank statements as part of the discovery evidence for this trial, and I know you have more than $1 million in savings. What happened to all of that money?" And he says, "Your Honor, I gave it away." "To who?" asks the judge, because he's thinking that this guy's going to need a psychological evaluation before they can move forward. And he says, "I gave it to the people whose lives I destroyed. I gave it to them so that they wouldn't lose their homes. And I want you to know that I'd like to change my plea to guilty, because I am guilty of the charges that have been levied against me, and I deserve to be punished for the things that I've done. I acted unethically, and I hurt a lot of people as a result of my actions." And everybody in the courtroom, they were silent. And then the judge, he starts writing some things down, and he looks up and he says, "You know, I've seen a lot of people, a lot of criminals come through my court in my time on the bench, but never have I seen someone have such a genuine change of heart and truly take ownership for their actions. So I'm inclined to give you the lightest sentence possible according to federal guidelines." Glenn ended up serving 3 months in federal prison, and when he got out, he actually started working for the federal government in the HARP Loan Modification Program, which was a program designed to help people who had gotten these NINA loans to restructure so that they could stay in their homes. And the first thing he did was he went through and he found the names of every single person he had sold a loan to in this company, and one at a time he would call them up and see if he could do anything for them, because he wanted to make sure that their house could become a home for them and their families. Amen.